When Dr. Elena Vasquez first made contact with the Vorthian delegation, she'd been expecting something more diplomatic. You know, the usual interstellar pleasantries. Maybe some of that weird bioluminescent poetry their species was famous for. Instead, she got a 7-foot-tall reptilian creature with too many teeth and an attitude problem that could have powered a small starship. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. Your planet smells like rust and regret, the Vorthian ambassador had said, and honestly, Elena couldn't even argue with that assessment. Earth did kind of have that vibe going on at any given moment. The real trouble started 3 weeks later, when the ambassador's family arrived. And when I say family, I mean a traveling pod of what Elena's team had started calling the Nightmare Squad, because apparently, creativity goes out the window when you're face-to-face with aliens who could eat you in approximately 4 seconds. The ambassador had brought his mate, Krell, who was somehow even more intimidating than he was. She had scars running across her scales like someone had tried to draw a map of her ancestral territories directly onto her skin. And then there were the cubs. 2 of them. Tiny little versions of pure, concentrated chaos wrapped in reptilian skin. Elena was standing in the observation room of the diplomatic facility, watching these cubs through reinforced glass, when her colleague Marcus jogged up beside her, looking like he'd just seen something that had fundamentally altered his understanding of reality. "Tell me," Elena said, not taking her eyes off the cubs, "that you found something in those bioscans that explains why those things seem determined to eat the conference table." "Actually," Marcus said, pulling up data on his handheld tablet, "that's kind of what I came to tell you about. Elena, these cubs, they're not just cute little murder machines. Well, I mean, they are, but they're also something else entirely. Please tell me this something else is less likely to result in my consumption," Elena muttered. "Their neural pathways," Marcus continued, getting that excited gleam in his eye that usually preceded either a fascinating discovery or the end of his career. "They're showing empathy markers off the charts. More complex emotional resonance than we'd even hypothesized for their species. When the ambassador's mate isn't looking, they've been..." He paused, scrolling through footage. "Playing. Like actual play fighting. But they're being careful not to hurt each other. That shouldn't be possible with apex predators at this developmental stage." Elena finally turned to look at him. "Are you telling me that the Nightmare Squad has feelings?" "Not just feelings. Social awareness, complex social structures. They're teaching each other, Elena. The older one is showing the younger one how to hunt. Not aggressively, but like teaching. It's actually kind of beautiful if you don't think too hard about the inherent violence." That's when the younger cub, the one that had started calling itself Vex through the translation matrix, decided to make a break for the human section of the facility, which was, in retrospect, not Elena's finest hour as a xenodiplomacy specialist. She was supposed to be trained for this. She'd done seminars. She'd read papers. She'd even attended that one workshop where they taught you how to tell if an alien was about to eat you based on pupil dilation. And yet there she was, scrambling backward as a 400-pound baby reptile came bounding around the corner like it had just discovered the meaning of existence and was determined to find out if that meaning was eat the tall, soft-bodied creatures. "Vex, no," Elena said, holding up her hands in what she hoped was a non-threatening manner. "Bad cub. Sit, roll over, do whatever it is apex predators do when they're supposed to be well-behaved." The cub, remarkably, stopped. It tilted its head, examining Elena with what could charitably be described as curiosity, and more accurately could be described as calculating the exact angle needed to sever her femoral artery. "You," the cub said through the translation matrix, its voice coming out as something between a growl and a chirp. "Smell interesting, like fear and something else. Something that makes me want to not eat you. Which is strange. I usually want to eat everything. It's kind of my whole personality trait." Elena blinked. She blinked again. She wondered if maybe she'd had a small stroke and was currently hallucinating the conversation. "So, Elena ventured carefully. Not eating me is good. We're on the same page there?" "Probably," Vex said. And then the cub sat down. Just like that. Plop, right there on the corridor floor, massive tail curling around its body. "But I'm only going to keep not eating you if you stay interesting. Fair warning." The older cub, who'd apparently been following its sibling the entire time, came sliding around the corner at approximately the speed of a freight train and skidded to a halt next to Vex, nearly careening into Elena in the process. This one had introduced itself as Krath, and it had approximately twice the attitude and half the patience of its younger sibling. "There you are," Krath said to Vex, in that tone that universally translates to, "I cannot believe I have to deal with you." Then, noticing Elena, the cub's entire demeanor shifted. Its scales darkened slightly, and it placed itself between Elena and Vex in a movement that was unmistakably protective. "Stay back. She is ours to be not eating." "I'm not yours," Elena said weakly. "You are now," Krath replied with absolute certainty. "Finders keepers. That's a universal law, right? I'm pretty sure I overheard the soft-bodied ambassador mention it." Marcus, who'd been filming the entire exchange, took that moment to start laughing. Actually laughing. Elena shot him a look that could have powered those starships I mentioned earlier, but he just waved her off, still recording. "This is going on the report," he said. "Central Command is going to lose their minds." What followed over the next 3 weeks was perhaps the most chaotic period in diplomatic history. The Cubs decided that Elena was, in fact, interesting enough to maintain a relationship with, which in Vorthian apparently meant she was now responsible for their entertainment, education, and general not-eating people schedule. It was exhausting, but also kind of amazing, if Elena was being honest with herself. Which she generally wasn't, because honesty made her realize how absolutely absurd this entire situation had become. Krath appointed itself as Elena's personal guard, which meant it followed her everywhere. And I mean everywhere. The cafeteria. Krath was there, making elaborate commentary about the quality of the food and whether or not the other humans smelled like they'd make good snacks. The medical bay. Krath was right there, offering unsolicited observations about human anatomical fragility that the doctors found either hilarious or terrifying, depending on their caffeine levels. "Your skeletal structure is fascinating," Krath had said to one unfortunate technician, leaning in very close with what could probably be interpreted as predatory interest. "So breakable. One good bite right here, and just think how everything would start rattling around inside like a broken toy." Elena had to physically remove the cub before the technician had a complete psychological meltdown. Vex, meanwhile, had discovered the absolutely hilarious fact that humans couldn't see in the infrared spectrum, which meant the younger cub could apparently play pranks in the dark. Elena's quarters had become less of a private space and more of an ever-shifting minefield of reptilian nonsense. She'd wake up to find the cub had rearranged her furniture or stolen her shoes, and hidden them in creative locations throughout the facility, or simply decided to sit on her head and offer critiques of her sleep schedule. "You move around too much," Vex had informed her at 3 in the morning while sitting, literally, on her face. "This is a sign of mental instability. I've read several human psychology papers. I'm helping you by keeping you still. You're welcome." Elena had been deeply uncertain how to respond to that particular interaction. The turning point came during a trade negotiation meeting. The Vorthians were discussing mineral rights to a sector on the outer edge of human space, and the negotiations had been going poorly. The Vorthian ambassador was, frankly, being unreasonable. He wanted exclusive mining rights to resources that humans had already marked for industrial use. There had been raised voices. There had been what could charitably be called aggressive posturing. At one point, the human delegate, an older woman named Patricia, who had the soul of a war general trapped in a diplomat's body, had actually stood up and accused the ambassador of negotiating in bad faith. The ambassador's response had been to lean back in his seat and growl something that the translation matrix helpfully rendered as, "Perhaps you soft-bodied creatures need a reminder of why you should be showing more respect." It was, by any reasonable assessment, a threat. Elena watched from the observation booth as Patricia's hand moved toward what was definitely not a pen on her desk. Things were about to go south in a way that would make the history books, and not in a good way. Then Krath stood up. The cub, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner the entire time, simply stood up and walked to the center of the conference room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Krath opened its mouth, and what came out was a sound that Elena would later struggle to describe to people. It was somewhere between a roar and a song, a sound that vibrated through the entire facility and made everyone's bones ache. The ambassador's scales, which had been darkened in aggression, suddenly shifted to a pale, shocked gray. "My parent," Krath said, and its voice carried an authority that seemed impossibly large from a creature that still had puppy fat on its jaw, "seems to have forgotten how cubs are taught to negotiate among our kind. We are taught that words are weapons only when speech has failed. We are taught that the respect of others is earned through the strength of our character, not the volume of our threats." Vex, apparently getting the signal, stood up as well and moved to stand beside its sibling. "This human," Vex said, gesturing at Patricia, "has shown more respect for diplomatic process than our parent has." She stood her ground. She used her words. She did not threaten to consume anyone. By our standards, she is demonstrating the kind of strength we value. The ambassador looked like he'd been hit by something invisible and was still processing the sensation. "Further," Krath continued, and honestly, Elena was starting to wonder if maybe the cubs had been attending every single negotiation meeting without her noticing. "This human and her representatives have been perfectly reasonable in their requests. The resources you're asking for are not essential to your survival. You're asking for excess simply because you can. That is not strength, that is greed. And we have been taught that greed is the mark of a weak mind." The younger cub nodded sagely. "Also, this human brought us candy yesterday, and it was delicious, so we like her now. That's probably relevant." There was a long moment of silence. Then Patricia, who'd been standing with her hand mid-reach, very slowly smiled. It was a smile like the morning sun breaking over a horizon. It was a smile that suggested she'd just witnessed something vindicate every choice she'd ever made in her life. "I like these ones," Patricia said, gesturing at the cubs. "Can we keep them?" Elena actually had to cough to cover what might have been a laugh or might have been the beginning of a breakdown. She wasn't entirely sure at this point. The negotiations, surprisingly, went much more smoothly after that. The ambassador, seeming to realize that his own cubs had just staged what could charitably be called a professional intervention, grudgingly agreed to more reasonable terms. And more remarkably, he actually apologized. To Patricia. To all the human representatives, actually. It was brief and clearly tasted like ashes in his mouth. But it happened. Afterward, in the observation booth, Marcus was grinning like a fool. "I cannot believe that just happened," he said. "Did you see that? Did you actually see that? Those cubs just educated their own parent on diplomacy. That's either the most heartwarming or most savage thing I've ever witnessed. And I genuinely cannot decide which." Elena was processing what had just occurred. They were listening, the whole time. They were learning how negotiations work by observing. "Not just observing," Marcus said. "Understanding. Those cubs have better social skills than most adults I know. Which means they're not just apex predators. They're apex predators with emotional intelligence. Elena, do you realize what that means?" Elena did realize, which was why she was currently having a bit of an existential crisis. The revelation changed things. Not immediately, but gradually. The human delegation started making more of an effort with the cubs. Patricia, in particular, seemed to have decided that Krath and Vex were the most interesting thing to happen to her diplomatic career, and she started bringing them into some of the negotiations, not as official participants, but as observers, the way diplomats had traditionally trained younger members. And the cubs thrived. Vex developed an almost scary ability to read tension in a room and address the emotional undercurrents before they could become actual problems. The cub would go quiet during heated discussions and then gently point out that maybe everyone just needed to take a step back and remember that they all actually wanted the same outcome, just framed differently. It was manipulation of the highest order, and it was absolutely effective. Krath, meanwhile, took the opposite approach. The older cubs seemed to find endless amusement in using pure logic to dismantle poorly structured arguments. An ambassador from the Heliodine Collective once spent 40 minutes trying to justify their claim to a particular trade route. And Krath just sat there, scales shifting with what Elena was becoming increasingly certain was the alien equivalent of trying not to laugh. And occasionally asked questions like, "But if that's the case, then how do you explain?" Until the entire Heliodine delegation had basically admitted their claim didn't hold water. "That was brutal," Elena said afterward. "That was justice," Krath replied. "They were lying. I don't like liars. Also, their logical structure had 7 distinct contradictions. 7. It was almost impressive in how badly constructed it was. 3 months into their time on Earth, the Vorthian delegation was scheduled to leave. The negotiations were concluded, trade agreements were finalized, technology exchanges were scheduled. It was, by any metric, a massive diplomatic success. The kind that would have historians writing papers for decades about what went right and why humans and Vorthians had managed to achieve such rapid and friendly relations. Elena knew why. It was because of 2 cubs who decided that the soft-bodied creatures of Earth were interesting enough to maintain relationships with, as Vex had originally put it. The night before their departure, Elena found herself in Krath's temporary quarters, which had become something like a weird hybrid of alien biology observation deck and teenage room. There were scales shed along the floor, which apparently was a sign of good health, and Krath had been very matter-of-fact about explaining that to the cleaning staff. There were also human books stacked in corners, and Elena realized with a start that Krath had been reading them. actual reading. From the stacks, Elena could see history texts, science journals, philosophy papers, and something that looked suspiciously like a romance novel that Patricia had probably left behind as a joke. "I won't lie," Krath said, noticing Elena's expression. "That last one is confusing. I don't understand why the humans engage in all that biting and screaming if they actually enjoy each other's company. Seems like mixed messaging." Elena fought down a laugh that probably would have come out as either hysterical or deeply inappropriate. "Yeah, well, humans are complicated. That's kind of what I like about you," Krath said. And there was something in the cub's tone that made Elena's chest feel tight in an unfamiliar way. "You're not just about survival and reproduction and resources. You think about weird things. You make art about sadness. You create music that doesn't serve any biological function. You're inefficient in the most beautiful way." Elena sat down on Krath's makeshift bed, constructed from what appeared to be approximately 17 blankets arranged into a nest. "We're not leaving tomorrow, you know. We're staying here. Earth is our home. You're the ones leaving." "I know," Krath said, "which is why I wanted to show you this." The cub moved to a data pad that had been carefully positioned on the floor and activated it. What appeared on screen was a message recorded in Krath's voice, but with subtitles in human language. "I am Krath, Cub of the Vorthian delegation," the recorded message began. "I have spent time on the human planet of Earth, and I have learned many things. I have learned that strength is not just physical. I have learned that respect must be earned through actions, not demands. I have learned that the soft-bodied creatures called humans are more resilient than their fragile forms suggest. Most importantly, I have learned that building bridges is harder than burning them, but infinitely more worthwhile." Elena watched as the recording continued, Krath explaining in careful terms that the Vorthian delegation was proposing a formal cultural exchange program. Young Vorthians would be sent to Earth to study. Human scholars would travel to the Vorthian homeworld, not just to exchange information, but to learn how to coexist. How to see past the predator and prey dichotomy that had nearly caused everything to explode in the conference room. "I made Vex help me with that," Krath said once the message finished. "Without them, I would have sounded too aggressive. Vex reminded me that sometimes when you're trying to convince someone of something, you have to lead with your heart and let your brain catch up." Elena realized at that moment that she was going to miss these creatures. Genuinely miss them, not in an abstract way, but in a concrete, ache-in-the-chest way that suggested maybe she'd gotten more attached to 2 alien cubs than was professionally advisable. "This is a good proposal," Elena said carefully. "This is actually a really good proposal." "I know," Krath said without a trace of false modesty. "We're apex predators. We're good at being good at things. But we're also learning that being good at crushing things is less useful than being good at building things." Vex showed up approximately 30 seconds later, which suggested it had been eavesdropping, as it apparently did constantly. "I came to tell you that we've also prepared something for the others," Vex said, jumping onto the nest with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested the younger cub had consumed an alarming amount of sugar. "There's a gift. For humanity. From us." The gift turned out to be medical research. The Vorthians had been studying human physiology and had apparently discovered several applications of their own biological systems that could be adapted to help humans with various ailments. Things like regenerative stem cell techniques, advanced prosthetics, treatments for diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries. All of it presented not as charity, but as a gesture of respect between species who were learning to work together. We're still apex predators, Krath explained, when Elena looked at them with an expression that was probably somewhere between gratitude and awe. We've still got teeth and claws and the ability to be absolutely terrifying when necessary. But you don't have to earn our respect through blood anymore. You can earn it through building something good. And honestly, that feels better. The departure was quiet. The ambassador and his mate seemed subtly different when they left, like maybe spending 3 months with beings who were simultaneously fragile and strong in ways that challenged their assumptions had altered something fundamental about how they saw the universe. The Cubs, though, waited until the very last moment, standing at the boarding ramp with their parents, looking at Elena and Patricia and Marcus and the rest of the human delegation who'd gathered to see them off. "I want to record something," Vex said suddenly, "before we go, just in case." The younger cub approached Elena and very carefully placed one clawed paw on her shoulder. The gesture was gentle despite the size of the claw and carefully deliberate. "If anyone tries to hurt her," Vex said, and the translation matrix rendered it in a tone that was somehow both playful and absolutely serious, "feed them to each other. She is ours to be not eating, which means we have decided she is worth keeping alive." Krath moved to stand beside its sibling, and the older cub did something that Elena would later realize was probably the most significant diplomatic gesture the Vorthians had made. It bared its throat, the vulnerable underside of its neck, the universal sign of submission and trust among predatory species. "She is under our protection," Krath said formally. "This is the law we recognize. This is the bond we claim." Then both cubs turned and walked up the boarding ramp without looking back, their parents following. And the ship lifted off in a column of light that turned the sky silver for just a moment. Marcus was grinning ear to ear. "Tell me you recorded that. Please tell me you recorded that." "Of course I did," Patricia said. And she was also grinning. But there was something soft in her expression, too. That's history. That's the moment two species decided to stop seeing each other as threats and start seeing each other as potential friends. Elena didn't say anything. She was too busy processing the realization that somewhere out there, on a ship heading back to another world, two cubs who had essentially decided they liked humans were probably rearranging their quarters and arguing about philosophy and making absolutely terrible jokes in their alien way. And somehow, that felt more important than any trade agreement or cultural exchange or medical breakthrough. Because they'd met as apex predator and soft-bodied prey. And they decided to be something better instead. 6 months later, the formal cultural exchange program was established. Elena was selected as the first human liaison to the Vorthian delegation, which meant she'd be spending the next 2 years living on the Vorthian homeworld. Her first day there, Krath and Vex were waiting for her at the landing platform, and they'd apparently grown. Not dramatically, but noticeable. The younger cub was now approximately 500 pounds of pure chaos. The older one had developed some additional scars, which Vex helpfully explained came from that time we tried to teach the younger hunters about respecting prey that might bite back. The prey bit back, Krath said matter-of-factly. It was educational. Did the prey live? Elena asked. Of course, Vex said, sounding mildly offended. We said respect, not kill. Respect means everyone goes home, just maybe a little sore. Elena spent her 2 years on the Vorthian homeworld learning their culture, teaching them about humanity, and generally watching as two apex predators became increasingly convinced that they were responsible for Elena's education, entertainment, and general well-being. It was, frankly, the best assignment of her career. When she finally returned to Earth, the cultural exchange had become something profound. Vorthian students were studying at human universities. Human scholars were learning from Vorthian philosophers. The predator and prey relationship had transformed into something more complex and more real. The first message Elena received upon returning to Earth was from Krath, transmitted across the light years faster than anything should theoretically be able to travel using technology that humans didn't fully understand. It read, in formal Vorthian with human translation, "We have decided that you are the bridge between our worlds. You remain interesting. Therefore, we continue the relationship. Also, Vex ate all the candy you left here. Vex wishes for you to know that this was deliberate and intentional, and Vex has no regrets. I am obligated to inform you of this. I personally believe Vex should have saved at least some." Elena laughed. And it was the kind of laugh that came from deep in her chest. The kind that suggested she'd found something in the universe that made sense even when nothing else did. Two species, meeting across the stars. A soft-bodied human and two apex predators with more emotional intelligence than should have been physically possible. And somehow, impossibly, they decided to be friends. That, Elena thought, was the real story worth telling. Not the diplomatic victories or the medical breakthroughs or the trade agreements. But the fact that sometimes, when you were weird enough and brave enough and willing to see past what something looked like to understand what it actually was, you could build something that lasted across the void. You could build a bridge. And on the other end of that bridge, there would be two aliens with sharp teeth and sharper minds, ready to have absolutely ridiculous conversations about philosophy and candy, and why humans insisted on making art about sad things when happy things were obviously superior subjects. Life, Elena had learned, was infinitely better with cubs who decided you were worth keeping alive.